January 31st, 1945. Clark Air Base, Luzon, Philippines. Major Frank T. McCoy's hands trembled slightly as he photographed the aircraft before him, an intact Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber bearing the tail number 763 Longton 12. "This cannot be their standard design," he muttered to his technical sergeant. "No Air Force would build bombers this way." The fuselage gleamed in the tropical sun, its distinctive cylindrical shape justifying the Allied nickname that would follow it through 4 years of war. Measuring nearly 20 meters from nose to tail, the bomber sat on its tricycle landing gear like a massive cigar resting on the tarmac. The wings, spanning 25 meters tip to tip, showed no battle damage. The engines, 14-cylinder Mitsubishi Kase radials producing 1,530 horsepower each, appeared intact. This was not a crashed aircraft salvaged from wreckage. This was a complete operational bomber abandoned by its crew during the American advance. But what captured McCoy's complete attention, what would revolutionize American understanding of Japanese aviation doctrine, was what he discovered when he climbed inside the wings through the inspection panels. The fuel tanks were completely unprotected. No self-sealing rubber compound, no armor plating, no fire suppression systems, no protective coatings of any kind. Just thin aluminum skin, perhaps 2 millimeters thick, separating thousands of liters of high-octane aviation fuel from enemy machine gun fire. Major McCoy commanded the Technical Air Intelligence Unit, Southwest Pacific. He had examined dozens of crashed Japanese aircraft across the Pacific theater. But nothing had prepared him for this moment. This bomber, abandoned intact during the American liberation of Clark Field, would expose a design philosophy so alien to Western military thinking that it would take months for analysts to fully comprehend its implications. The mathematics of this discovery would reshape American tactical doctrine and aircraft design for the remainder of the war. Every assumption American pilots held about enemy capabilities, about the price Japanese engineers were willing to pay for performance, about the value imperial forces placed on crew survival. All of it was about to be systematically demolished by the evidence contained within this single pristine example of Japan's most important bomber. The journey to this revelation had begun 4 years earlier, on December 8, 1941. That morning, as smoke still rose from Pearl Harbor, 82 G4M bombers and 26 older G3M bombers lifted off from bases on Formosa. Their target was Clark Field itself, the primary American air base in the Philippines, the very field where Major McCoy would discover their secret years later. The attack achieved complete tactical surprise. Arriving at 12:35 in the afternoon, the Japanese formation flew at 20,000 feet, beyond the reach of American anti-aircraft guns. 27 bombers from the initial wave dropped 636 bombs across Clark Field's runways and facilities. Moments later, 0 fighters swept in at treetop level, their machine guns destroying every aircraft that had survived the bombing run. Of 17 B-17 flying fortresses on the ground, 12 were destroyed outright. Nearly every P-40 Warhawk fighter was reduced to burning wreckage. In 45 minutes, American air power in the Philippines had been effectively eliminated. Lieutenant James Harrington, one of the few surviving American pilots, watched from a bomb shelter as the Japanese formation withdrew to the north. "What struck me," he later wrote in his combat report, "was how they came in. Perfect formation, high altitude, totally beyond our reach. Then the fighters dropped down and tore us apart. We couldn't get a single plane airborne." But the Betty bombers themselves had departed untouched. The few American fighters that managed to get airborne arrived too late, finding only empty sky. The Japanese had demonstrated their bombers' exceptional range, striking from bases 460 miles away, a feat no American bomber could match at that stage of the war. 2 days later, on December 10, 1941, the Betty bomber would achieve something even more devastating. 26 G4M bombers joined with older G3M Nell bombers in attacking Force Z, a British naval task force built around the battleship HMS Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser HMS Repulse. The attack began at approximately 12:20 in the afternoon. Japanese bombers approached in coordinated waves, their torpedo runs executed with precision that stunned British observers. The Betty bombers carried Type 91 aerial torpedoes, each weighing 840 kilograms with a 205-kilogram warhead. The torpedoes were designed specifically for shallow water operations, running at depths that could strike ships even in coastal waters. The torpedo attacks focused on the two capital ships with devastating accuracy. Prince of Wales, a battleship displacing 43,000 tons and representing the newest generation of British naval power, took at least 6 torpedo hits along with damage from level bombers. The underwater explosions ripped massive holes in the ship's hull. Flooding overwhelmed damage control efforts. The battleship began listing severely. Repulse, a battlecruiser built during World War I but modernized in the 1930s, absorbed at least 4 torpedo hits while attempting to evade the attacking aircraft. The ship's anti-aircraft fire claimed several Japanese aircraft, but could not prevent the coordinated torpedo runs from finding their targets. The cumulative damage proved fatal. Both capital ships capsized and sank within hours of the attack. Prince of Wales went down at approximately 13:20 hours. Repulse followed at approximately 13:33 hours. 841 British sailors died. The survivors were rescued by escorting destroyers. The engagement lasted less than 2 hours from first contact to final sinking. For the first time in naval history, capital ships actively defending themselves had been sunk solely by air power while in the open sea. The G4M Betty bomber had achieved what naval theorists had debated for decades. British naval superiority in Asian waters had been shattered in 90 minutes. Across the Pacific theater through early 1942, American and Allied pilots encountered Betty bombers in every major engagement. The aircraft seemed to operate with impunity, striking targets at ranges that defied conventional understanding. They hit Darwin, Australia from bases 1,500 miles away, demonstrating reach that exceeded any Allied bomber's capability. They attacked Port Moresby from airfields across New Guinea's mountain ranges, maintaining pressure on Allied positions throughout the Southwest Pacific. They struck Guadalcanal from Rabaul, a distance exceeding 600 miles, projecting Japanese air power across vast ocean expanses. The Betty's operational range gave Japanese forces strategic flexibility that Allied commanders struggled to counter. American fighters based at forward positions lacked the range to intercept Betty bombers departing from distant bases. Allied airfields came under attack from Japanese bases that were themselves beyond Allied striking range. The asymmetry in bomber capability meant that Japanese forces could attack at will while Allied forces struggled to retaliate effectively. This advantage persisted through the first 6 months of the war. Betty bombers participated in virtually every Japanese offensive operation across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. They struck targets in the Philippines, Malaya, Netherlands, East Indies, New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands. They supported naval operations throughout the theater. They performed reconnaissance missions that exceeded the range of any Allied aircraft. The Betty became the symbol of Japanese air power's reach and effectiveness. But this advantage depended entirely on limited Allied fighter opposition. When Betty formations could strike without interception, when they could approach targets at high altitude beyond anti-aircraft range, when they could deliver weapons and depart before fighters arrived, the aircraft was devastatingly effective. These conditions characterized operations during the first half of 1942, when Allied air strength remained limited and dispersed. American and British forces were still reeling from the initial Japanese onslaught, still concentrating on defensive operations, still building the fighter strength and pilot experience needed to challenge Japanese air superiority. But by mid-1942, the tactical picture began to change. As American fighter strength increased, as Wildcats gave way to more capable Hellcats and Corsairs, as pilot training improved and tactical doctrine evolved, Betty crews began reporting disturbing losses. The technical specifications that made the Betty so formidable were becoming evident to American intelligence even before Major McCoy's discovery at Clark Field. Crashed Betty bombers examined at various locations across the Pacific revealed an aircraft optimized ruthlessly for range and speed. The G4M Model 1, the variant that bore the brunt of early war operations, had an empty weight of just 6,101 kilograms. This was remarkably light for a bomber of its size. Maximum takeoff weight reached 9,500 kilograms. The difference, 2,359 kilograms, represented fuel, ordnance, crew, and equipment. Fuel capacity was extraordinary. 4,180 liters distributed across 8 tanks, 4 in each wing, positioned in the wing's center section, where they were most vulnerable to combat damage. This fuel load weighed approximately 3,824 kilograms, more than half the aircraft's maximum takeoff weight. The commitment to fuel capacity over every other consideration was absolute. Top speed reached 428 kilometers per hour, approximately 265 miles per hour. This was respectable but not exceptional. American fighters could easily exceed this speed. But the Betty wasn't designed to outrun fighters. It was designed to operate beyond their range. Maximum range exceeded 6,000 kilometers, more than 3,700 miles. No other bomber in service anywhere in the world in 1941 could match this capability. American B-17s had a maximum range of approximately 2,000 miles. British bombers were even more limited. The Betty could strike targets that other nations' bombers couldn't reach, operating from bases that enemies considered safe. Service ceiling reached 8,500 meters, approximately 28,000 feet, high enough to avoid most anti-aircraft fire, though not high enough to escape determined fighter interception. Crew complement was 7: pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, radio operator, and 2 gunners. Defensive armament consisted of 4 7.7mm machine guns and 1 20mm cannon in the tail. This was adequate against unescorted attacks, but woefully insufficient against concentrated fighter opposition. The fuel system design was particularly revealing to American engineers who examined crashed examples. The 8 tanks were arranged in 4 groups of 2, positioned along the wing's longitudinal axis, where the wing joined the fuselage. This placement maximized fuel capacity by utilizing the thickest portion of the wing structure. But it also positioned the tanks directly in the path of enemy fire during combat. Any attack from the side, from below, or from above rear angles would inevitably strike fuel tanks. The aluminum construction provided no protection whatsoever. The absence of self-sealing compounds meant that even small punctures would leak fuel continuously. American engineers examining crashed Betty bombers in late 1941 and early 1942 initially assumed this was temporary, perhaps early production aircraft that would receive protection systems later. The alternative seemed impossible. No air force would mass-produce bombers with completely unprotected fuel systems. The vulnerability was so extreme that it defied rational military planning. But as more examples were examined, as intelligence accumulated from multiple sources, the truth became undeniable. This was not a temporary expedient. This was deliberate design. Every Betty bomber produced featured the same unprotected fuel tanks. This was Japanese standard practice. The weight saved by eliminating protection systems was immediately calculable. American engineers determined that comprehensive fuel tank protection, self-sealing compounds, protective armor around tank areas, fire suppression systems, would add approximately 500 to 600 kilograms to the aircraft's empty weight. This weight penalty would have reduced fuel capacity by approximately 400 to 500 liters, cutting maximum range by roughly 1,000 kilometers. The Betty would still have exceptional range, but it would no longer be able to strike targets at distances that no other bomber could reach. Japanese designers had made a calculated trade, sacrifice all protection to achieve unmatched range. The decision would define the Betty's entire operational history. Through the first 6 months of 1942, this trade seemed justified by results. Betty bombers struck targets across thousands of miles of ocean. They sank capital ships. They destroyed airfields. They supported every major Japanese offensive operation. Their crews suffered casualties, certainly, but acceptable casualties within the context of successful operations. But the conditions that made this trade acceptable were already changing. American fighter strength was increasing. Pilot quality was improving as combat veterans trained new squadrons. Tactical doctrine was evolving based on combat experience. Radar systems were being deployed, providing warning of incoming raids. The environment that had permitted Betty bombers to operate with acceptable losses was disappearing. On August 8, 1942, the shift became undeniable. 23 G4M bombers from the 4th Air Group departed Repulse to attack American positions at Guadalcanal. American fighters intercepted the formation over Savo Island. In the engagement that followed, 18 of the 23 Betty bombers were shot down. Approximately 120 aviators died, 6 complete crews, plus additional casualties from damaged aircraft that crashed attempting to return to base. This was the single worst G4M loss during the entire campaign, but it would not be the last devastating engagement. Fighter pilots reported the same observation across every engagement. The Betty exploded into flames with minimal hits. 2 or 3 rounds anywhere along the fuselage or wings produced catastrophic results. The aircraft earned grim nicknames that spread rapidly through American squadrons. Flying Cigar, One-Shot Lighter, Flying Zippo, all references to the Betty's terrifying tendency to bloom into fire from battle damage. Lieutenant Commander John Thomas Blackburn, arriving at Guadalcanal in October 1942 commanding VF-17 flying F-4U Corsairs, later reported, "First time we caught a Betty formation, we couldn't believe how easy they went down. Hit them anywhere along the fuselage or wings and they'd explode. We actively hunted them, recognizing them as among the most vulnerable targets in Pacific skies." The transformation was complete. In 6 months, the Betty had evolved from feared long-range bomber to flying death trap. The design choices that had enabled its early successes had become the mechanism of its systematic destruction. But the true extent of the Betty's vulnerability, the engineering decisions that made such catastrophic losses inevitable, would not be fully understood until American forces began capturing intact examples for detailed examination. The first significant intelligence breakthrough came in November 1942, when Australian forces overran Japanese airfields at Buna in Papua New Guinea. Among the abandoned aircraft, technical air intelligence units discovered Betty bombers with varying levels of damage. Initial examinations confirmed what pilots had reported. The fuel tanks had no protection whatsoever. Aeronautical engineers with the Allied Technical Air Intelligence Unit, Southwest Pacific, conducted the first detailed analysis. The wing access panels revealed fuel cells with no protective measures, thin aluminum construction, no rubber sealant layer, no protective coating, no fire suppression systems. Multiple Betty bombers examined at Buna showed identical characteristics. This was not battle damage or field modification. This was standard Japanese design. The implications were staggering. American bombers by 1942 universally featured self-sealing fuel tanks. The B-17 Flying Fortress had incorporated them from the B-17C model onward. The B-24 Liberator featured them from the XB-24B prototype. Even fighter aircraft like the P-38 Lightning and P-47 Thunderbolt featured protected fuel systems. Self-sealing fuel tanks used layered rubber compound that swelled on contact with fuel when punctured by bullets or shell fragments, sealing holes and preventing fuel loss and fire. The technology added substantial weight to aircraft, but dramatically improved crew survival rates. American military doctrine considered this weight penalty essential and non-negotiable. Yet here was Japan's primary land-based bomber, produced in thousands, operating across the entire Pacific theater, with fuel tanks that offered zero protection. The weight saved by eliminating self-sealing systems, armor plating, and fire suppression equipment was immediately apparent. But the cost in crew lives was becoming equally obvious in loss statistics that mounted with every engagement. The captured Betty at Clark Field in January 1945 would provide the most complete technical analysis. Major McCoy and his team spent 3 weeks dismantling and documenting every system. Their report, classified secret and distributed to all Allied air forces, detailed specifications that explained both the Betty's extraordinary capabilities and its catastrophic vulnerabilities. What Major McCoy discovered inside tail number 763-12 was the physical manifestation of a design philosophy that had killed thousands of Japanese airmen. The unprotected fuel tanks weren't an oversight. They weren't a temporary expedient. They weren't a design failure. They were a deliberate choice, made in 1937 by engineers who believed that range mattered more than survival. And understanding why that choice was made, understanding the assumptions and calculations that led Japanese designers to create an aircraft that would systematically kill its own crews, would require examining the origins of the Betty's development and the military doctrine that shaped its requirements. The journey to understanding why Japanese engineers created the Betty began in September 1937, when the Imperial Japanese Navy issued specifications that would define the aircraft's entire existence. The requirements reflected not engineering preferences, but strategic imperatives born from geography and ambition. Top speed, 398 kilometers per hour. Cruising altitude, 3,000 meters. Range, 4,722 kilometers unloaded, or 3,700 kilometers carrying 800 kilograms of bombs or torpedoes. These numbers weren't arbitrary. They were calculated based on the distances Japanese forces would need to cover in any future Pacific conflict. From Formosa to the Philippines, 460 miles. From Rabaul to Guadalcanal, 600 miles. From Japanese home islands to potential targets across the Pacific, thousands of miles. The bomber that could meet these requirements would give Japan strategic reach that no other nation possessed. But the requirements also reflected assumptions about future warfare that would prove catastrophically wrong. Japanese planners assumed that surprise and initiative would provide protection for long-range bombers. They assumed that enemy fighter opposition would be limited by range and numbers. They assumed that the war would be decided quickly, before enemy industrial capacity could generate overwhelming force. Every assumption would prove false. The man tasked with achieving the impossible was Kiro Honjo, who led the Mitsubishi design team. Honjo had studied bomber design at Junkers in Germany during the early 1930s, absorbing European aeronautical engineering principles before returning to Japan. He understood immediately that meeting the Navy's requirements would demand compromises that Western air forces would never accept. Honjo assembled his team at Mitsubishi's Nagoya facilities to tackle the design challenges. They analyzed every aspect of bomber design, calculating weight budgets for every component and system. They studied existing bombers from multiple nations, identifying where weight could be reduced without compromising structural integrity. They experimented with new construction techniques and materials that might offer weight savings. The mathematics were brutally simple. To achieve the required range, the aircraft needed massive fuel capacity. Each liter of aviation fuel weighed approximately 0.8 kilograms. 4,180 liters of fuel meant approximately 3,824 kilograms of fuel weight at full load. To achieve the required speed with this fuel load, the aircraft needed minimal empty weight. Every kilogram added to the empty weight reduced either range or payload capacity. These two requirements existed in direct opposition. Fuel was heavy. Protection systems were heavy. Armor plating, Hundreds of kilograms would be required to protect crew positions and vital systems. Self-sealing fuel tanks added substantial weight through the rubber compounds, and additional structure required. Fire suppression systems added weight. Redundant safety measures added weight. The cumulative weight of adequate protection would prevent achieving the required performance. Honjo made the decision that would define the G4M throughout its service life. Protection would be sacrificed for performance. The fuel tanks would be unprotected aluminum construction. No self-sealing compounds. No armor plating around fuel cells. No fire suppression systems beyond basic fire extinguishers. No redundant safety measures. Every kilogram saved would be invested in fuel capacity, range, and achieving the Navy's performance specifications. The decision was not made lightly. Honjo understood the risks. His team calculated the vulnerabilities that unprotected fuel tanks would create. They knew that combat damage to the wings would likely prove catastrophic. But they also knew that the Navy's requirements could not be met any other way with available technology in 1937. The choice was between an aircraft that met performance specifications with known vulnerabilities, or an aircraft that failed to meet requirements but offered better protection. The Navy had demanded performance. Honjo delivered performance. The first G4M prototype flew on October 23, 1939. The aircraft met every performance requirement the Navy had specified. Speed exceeded expectations. Range surpassed projections. Payload capacity satisfied operational needs. The bomber entered production as the Navy Type 1 attack bomber, with Mitsubishi building the aircraft at plants in Nagoya. Initial production models, designated G4M Model 1, began reaching operational units in April 1941. By December 1941, approximately 180 G4Ms were in service with the Japanese Navy. These aircraft would form the backbone of Japanese land-based air power throughout the Pacific War. The Betty's combat debut at Clark Field and against Force Z demonstrated the wisdom of Honjo's design priorities in the specific conditions of early 1942. When facing limited opposition, when achieving surprise, when operating beyond the range of enemy fighters, the Betty was devastatingly effective. Its range allowed strikes from bases that enemies considered safe. Its speed permitted rapid penetration of target areas. Its payload delivered meaningful damage. But these advantages depended entirely on the assumption that Betty formations would face minimal opposition. The moment American fighter strength increased, the moment interception became routine, the moment sustained combat became inevitable, every design choice that prioritized range over protection became a death sentence for crews. The Guadalcanal campaign exposed the fundamental flaw in the Betty's design philosophy with statistical brutality. From August through November 1942, Japanese naval air forces lost more than 100 G4M bombers with their crews, in what became sustained bloodletting that could not be sustained. The pattern established on August 8th repeated with relentless consistency. Betty formations would depart from Repulse, fly 600 miles to Guadalcanal, engage American fighters, and suffer catastrophic losses. August 9th saw additional bombers lost. August 10th brought more casualties. By the end of August, the 4th Air Group had been effectively destroyed as an operational unit. September brought no respite. Betty formations continued striking American positions at Guadalcanal, and American fighters continued destroying them in overwhelming numbers. The mathematics were inexorable. Japanese forces needed to strike American positions to contest control of the island. Betty bombers provided the only means of delivering meaningful strike capability from Repulse, but every mission resulted in losses that could not be replaced. Lieutenant Yasuo Kuwahara, a Betty pilot who survived 7 missions over Guadalcanal before transfer to training duties, later described the psychological impact. "We knew before takeoff that many aircraft would not return. We could calculate the odds. 20 aircraft depart. 4 or 5 fail to return. The next mission, perhaps 6 fail to return. Everyone understood that eventually your number would come up. It was not a question of if, but when. American fighter pilots developed tactics specifically to exploit Betty vulnerabilities. Rather than engaging in prolonged dogfights, they focused on quick slashing attacks aimed at the wings and fuselage where fuel tanks were located. A 2-second burst from 650 caliber machine guns, approximately 60 rounds, was usually sufficient to ignite a Betty's fuel system. Captain Joseph Foss, flying F-4F Wildcats with VMF-121 from Henderson Field, described the tactical approach. We learned to aim for the wing roots where it joined the fuselage. That's where their fuel tanks were. 2 or 3 good hits and the whole aircraft would bloom into flame. We didn't need to destroy the engines or kill the crew. We just needed to puncture those tanks, and physics did the rest. The physics Captain Foss referenced was the interaction between high-octane aviation fuel, oxygen, and ignition sources. Aviation fuel in 1942 had an octane rating of 100, meaning it was highly volatile and burned extremely hot. When fuel tanks were punctured, fuel vapor mixed with air created an explosive atmosphere. Any spark, tracer rounds, metal-on-metal friction, electrical shorts, would ignite this mixture instantly. In protected fuel tanks with self-sealing compounds, punctures were sealed within seconds as the rubber swelled on contact with fuel. The amount of fuel vapor released was minimal. Fire risk was significantly reduced. In unprotected tanks, fuel streamed out continuously. Vapor clouds formed behind the aircraft. Any ignition source anywhere in the vapor trail would propagate back to the tanks in milliseconds. American gunnery camera footage from Guadalcanal missions captured this phenomenon repeatedly. The film showed Betty bombers taking hits to wing areas, continuing to fly for 2 or 3 seconds while fuel vapor streamed behind them, then suddenly erupting into massive fireballs as the vapor ignited. The explosions were so violent that aircraft often broke apart in mid-air, wings separating from fuselage, crew members thrown clear, still strapped in their seats. Of the Betty crew members shot down over Guadalcanal, survival rates were catastrophic. Japanese records indicate that fewer than 5% of crew members from destroyed Betty bombers survived. Most died in the initial explosion or fire. Those who managed to bail out often perished in the ocean, unable to reach land or be rescued. The few who survived to be captured provided testimony that American intelligence found difficult to believe initially. Petty Officer Second Class Tomiharu Honda, captured after his Betty exploded over Savo Island in September 1942, told interrogators, "We called it the flying lighter. Everyone knew. The moment you were assigned to Betty crews, you understood your life expectancy was measured in missions, not years. Some pilots refused to fly it. They were court-martialed. Most of us flew because we had no choice, and because we believed our deaths would serve the emperor." By mid-1943, Japanese engineers recognized that modifications were essential. The loss rates had become unsustainable. Starting with the 663rd aircraft, produced in March 1943, 30mm rubber sheets were installed beneath wing surfaces where fuel tanks were located. These sheets were not true self-sealing tanks. They were a compromise measure, adding minimal weight while providing limited protection against fuel leakage. The modification reduced top speed by 9 kilometers per hour. Maximum range decreased by 315 kilometers. But crew survival rates showed no significant improvement. The rubber sheets could slow fuel leakage from small-caliber hits. They could not prevent fires from larger-caliber rounds or 20mm cannon shells that were becoming standard on American fighters by 1943. They could not stop explosions when tracer rounds ignited fuel vapor. The fundamental vulnerability remained unchanged. American pilots reported little difference in Betty vulnerability after the modifications appeared. Lieutenant Commander Roger Hedrick, flying F-6F Hellcats with VF-17 in late 1943, observed, "We heard intelligence reports that the Japanese had added some kind of protection to Betty fuel tanks. We didn't notice any difference. they still exploded just as easily. Maybe they burned slightly slower, but the result was the same: dead Japanese crews and burning wrecks. Japanese designers attempted more comprehensive protection with the G4M Model 3, introduced in October 1944. This variant featured actual self-sealing fuel tanks with capacity reduced to 4,490 liters to accommodate the leak-blocking material. The modification reduced maximum range to 3,640 kilometers, a loss of more than 2,000 kilometers compared to the original G4M Model 1. Approximately 60 G4M Model 3 aircraft were produced by war's end. The modification came too late and in too limited numbers to affect the Betty's combat record. By late 1944, American air superiority was so complete that no level of fuel tank protection would have permitted Betty bombers to operate effectively in daylight. The war's outcome had already been determined. The Betty's vulnerability became so notorious that American forces began using the aircraft in ways that highlighted the dangers Japanese crews faced. On April 18, 1943, the Betty bomber became the instrument of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's death in an engagement that demonstrated both American signals intelligence capabilities and the aircraft's fatal weaknesses. American codebreakers intercepted Japanese communications indicating that Yamamoto would fly from Rabaul to Bougainville on April 18. The Admiral would travel aboard a G4M bomber with a fighter escort. 18 P-38 Lightnings from the 339th Fighter Squadron were assigned to intercept the flight. The mission required extraordinary precision. The P-38s would fly over 400 miles at wavetop height to avoid radar detection, navigate across open ocean without landmarks, and arrive at exactly the calculated intercept point, at exactly the calculated time. Any error in navigation, any deviation in timing, would result in mission failure. The P-38s departed Guadalcanal at 07:25 hours. They flew at 50 feet above the ocean for over 400 miles, maintaining strict radio silence. Navigation was by dead reckoning and timing. The formation arrived at the calculated intercept point with precision that would become legendary in aviation history. At 09:34 hours, exactly on schedule and exactly 1 minute ahead of the calculated intercept time, the P-38s spotted Yamamoto's formation. 2 Betty bombers flying at low altitude with 6 Zero fighters as escort. Captain Thomas Lanphier and First Lieutenant Rex Barber broke from the formation to engage the bombers, while other P-38s held off the Zero fighters. Barber engaged the lead Betty bomber, which carried Admiral Yamamoto. The bomber took hits to the wing area where the unprotected fuel tanks were located. The aircraft exploded in flames and crashed into the jungle. Yamamoto's body was recovered the following day. He had been killed by injuries sustained during the crash, but the crash itself had been caused by the catastrophic fire resulting from fuel tank damage. There was no possibility of Yamamoto's bomber surviving once it came under attack. The unprotected fuel tanks ensured that any damage would be catastrophic. The Betty's vulnerability reached its most dramatic demonstration on March 21, 1945. 18 G4M bombers took off from Kanoya Air Base, each carrying an MXY-7 Oka rocket bomb beneath its fuselage. The Oka was a piloted rocket-powered aircraft with a 200-kilogram warhead designed for kamikaze attacks against American ships. The mission required the Betty bombers to fly within 20 kilometers of their targets before releasing the Oka aircraft. The Oka pilot would then ignite the rocket motor and dive at speeds exceeding 650 kilometers per hour toward American ships. The warhead's 200 kilograms of explosives would destroy any vessel it struck, but the mission depended entirely on the Betty bombers surviving long enough to reach release range. The formation departed Kanoya at approximately 14:30 hours. The 18 G4M bombers flew in tight formation with fighter escort, heading toward American naval forces off Okinawa. Each bomber carried an Oka weapon beneath its fuselage, adding substantial weight and drag that reduced speed and maneuverability. The bombers were even more vulnerable than usual, unable to evade or maneuver effectively while carrying the Oka loads. American radar detected the formation at approximately 100 miles distance. F-6F Hellcat fighters from USS Hornet were scrambled to intercept. The Hellcats reached the Japanese formation well before it approached release range for the Oka weapons. In the engagement that followed, American fighters systematically destroyed the entire formation. The Betty bombers, already vulnerable under normal circumstances, proved completely helpless while carrying Oka weapons. The additional weight prevented evasive maneuvers. The external weapon created drag that reduced speed. The unprotected fuel tanks guaranteed that any hit would be fatal. One by one, the bombers exploded and fell into the ocean. Not a single Betty bomber survived to reach release range. Not a single Oka weapon was launched against American ships. 137 bomber crew members and 15 Oka pilots died in the attack. The mission represented the ultimate expression of the Betty's fundamental flaw. An aircraft designed to deliver weapons to distant targets could not survive to deliver those weapons when facing prepared opposition. The extraordinary range that made the mission theoretically possible meant nothing when the aircraft exploded before reaching weapon release range. Lieutenant Commander John Bridgers, leading the Hellcat section that intercepted the Oka mission, later described the engagement. It was almost too easy. The Betty bombers were so loaded down with those rocket bombs that they could barely maneuver. We just lined up and fired. They exploded one after another. The whole thing was over in maybe 10 minutes. I remember thinking that the Japanese were sending their men to die in aircraft that had no chance of survival. It wasn't combat. It was systematic slaughter. By early 1945, when Major McCoy discovered the intact Betty at Clark Field, the aircraft's combat record had become a statistical monument to the cost of prioritizing performance over protection. Japanese records, incomplete due to war's chaos but sufficient for broad analysis, indicated that approximately 60% of all G4M bombers produced were lost in combat operations. This loss rate exceeded any other major aircraft type in any air force during World War II. For comparison, American B-17 Flying Fortresses suffered approximately 30% losses in combat, still devastating, but half the rate of Betty casualties. British Lancaster bombers lost approximately 35% to enemy action. German Junkers Ju-88 bombers, operating under increasingly desperate conditions as the war turned against Germany, lost approximately 40% to all causes. The Betty's 60% loss rate wasn't just the highest among bombers, it was among the highest of any aircraft type in any air force during the entire war. Only specialized attack aircraft like German Stukas operating against heavy opposition, or kamikaze aircraft intentionally designed for one-way missions, suffered comparable or higher loss rates. But those aircraft operated in roles where high casualties were expected. The Betty was designed as a standard operational bomber, intended to conduct repeated missions over years of service. The loss rates indicated that this intention had failed catastrophically. The human cost was staggering. Each Betty carried 7 crew members. With approximately 2,114 Betty bombers produced and 60% lost in combat, that meant approximately 1,249 aircraft destroyed with their crews, over 10,000 Japanese aviators killed. This number doesn't include crew members killed in aircraft that crashed on return or died from injuries sustained in combat, or were lost in training accidents. Japanese naval aviation began the war with approximately 3,500 highly trained pilots and aircrew. By war's end, virtually all had been killed. The majority in aircraft whose design philosophy prioritized mission capability over crew survival. The Betty bomber represented the physical manifestation of that philosophy, and its loss statistics documented the cost. The production statistics for the Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber tell a story that transcends simple manufacturing numbers. They document a nation's commitment to a design philosophy, even as that philosophy consumed the lives of those it was supposed to protect. Total production reached approximately 2,214 aircraft across all variants between 1941 and August 1945. Some sources cite figures as high as 2,435 when including all prototypes and subtypes. The variation in total numbers reflects different methods of counting prototypes, subtypes, and transport variants. But the core figure, approximately 2,400 aircraft, represents one of the largest production runs for any Japanese bomber type during World War II. The G4M Model 1 comprised approximately 172 aircraft, produced from April 1941 through early 1943. This variant featured the original unprotected fuel tank design with capacity of 4,780 liters. Top speed reached 428 kilometers per hour. Maximum range of 6,034 kilometers made it the longest-ranged bomber in service anywhere in the world at the time of its introduction. But the complete absence of protection systems made it catastrophically vulnerable once American fighter strength increased beyond early war levels. The G4M Model 2, with increased fuel capacity and slightly higher speed, accounted for approximately 1,142 examples produced from 1943 through 1945. This variant increased fuel capacity to 6,190 liters, extending maximum range even further to approximately 6,500 kilometers. Top speed increased slightly to 437 kilometers per hour. But the Model 2 retained the fundamental vulnerability of unprotected fuel tanks. The modifications improved performance without addressing survivability, doubling down on the original design philosophy even as loss rates demonstrated its fatal inadequacy. The G4M Model 3, designated Model 34, represented the only variant with actual self-sealing fuel tanks. Production began in October 1944, but only 60 to 91 aircraft were completed by war's end, depending on source. The self-sealing tanks reduced fuel capacity to 4,190 liters to accommodate the leak-blocking material. Maximum range decreased to 3,640 kilometers, a loss of more than 2,000 kilometers compared to the Model 1. This was the performance penalty Japanese designers had been unwilling to accept in 1937. By 1944, when the Model 3 finally entered production with protected fuel tanks, the strategic situation had deteriorated so completely that the improved survivability made no practical difference. American air superiority over Japanese-controlled waters was absolute. Betty bombers, regardless of fuel tank protection, could no longer operate effectively in daylight against American opposition. The G6M transport variant, converted from bomber airframes, added another 30 aircraft. These transport versions carried passengers and cargo rather than weapons, serving in liaison and communications roles. The G6M Model 1 used for one of the surrender aircraft in August 1945 represented this variant. Production continued through August 1945, with final aircraft completed just days before Japan's surrender. Mitsubishi factories produced Betty bombers at peak rates of approximately 100 aircraft per month during 1943. Production decreased in 1944 and 1945 as Allied bombing disrupted Japanese industry and as resources were diverted to fighter production for homeland defense. These production numbers made the Betty one of Japan's most numerous bombers. Over 4 years of war, Mitsubishi delivered approximately 2,400 aircraft to Japanese Navy units across the Pacific Theater. The bombers served in every major campaign, participated in every significant naval engagement, and struck targets across distances spanning thousands of kilometers. But production statistics tell only part of the story. Loss rates tell the rest. Few Betty bombers survived to war's end. Japanese aviation records, though incomplete due to wartime chaos and post-war destruction, indicate that approximately 1,349 G4M bombers were lost in combat operations, a loss rate of 60% of total production. This figure doesn't include aircraft destroyed in accidents, lost to mechanical failure, or damaged beyond repair and scrapped. By August 1945, when Japan surrendered, operational Betty bomber strength had fallen to fewer than 50 aircraft. The bombers that had numbered in the hundreds in 1942 had been reduced to a remnant force by attrition that no amount of production could offset. The human cost exceeded calculation in its totality, but surviving records permit partial accounting. Each Betty carried 7 crew members: pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, radio operator, and 2 gunners. With approximately 1,149 aircraft destroyed in combat, that meant over 10,000 crew positions lost. Not all aircraft losses resulted in complete crew casualties. Some crew members survived bailouts or crash landings, but Japanese records indicate that crew survival rates from Betty losses averaged below 10%. This suggests that approximately 9,000 Japanese naval aviators died in Betty bombers during the war. For comparison, the entire Japanese Navy entered the war with approximately 3,500 trained pilots and aircrew. The Betty alone consumed more than twice that number over 4 years of operations. These casualties represented not just numbers, but the systematic destruction of Japanese naval aviation expertise. The crews who died in Betty bombers were among the most highly trained personnel in the Japanese military. Pilot training required 18 to 24 months. Navigator training required 12 to 18 months. Radio operators and bombardiers underwent specialized technical training lasting months. The loss of this expertise proved irreplaceable. By 1944, Japanese training programs had been reduced to weeks rather than months due to fuel shortages and the urgent need for replacement crews. The quality differential between 1941 veterans and 1944 replacements was profound. Veteran crews had survival rates marginally better than inexperienced crews, but both flew aircraft whose design made survival statistically improbable. Former Flight Petty Officer Masato Honda, who completed 28 combat missions in Betty bombers before transfer to training duties in mid-1943, offered the most direct summary of crew attitudes. The Betty was a magnificent aircraft that asked us to die for its range. We flew it because we were ordered to fly it. We died in it because that was what it was designed to make us do. We understood this. Everyone understood this. But we flew anyway, because that was our duty. Honda's testimony reveals the psychological burden Betty crews carried. They weren't naive about their aircraft's vulnerabilities. They understood exactly what the unprotected fuel tanks meant for their survival odds. But Japanese military culture, built on concepts of duty and sacrifice that valued mission accomplishment over individual survival, provided no mechanism for refusing orders based on concerns about personal safety. American interrogators who interviewed surviving Betty crew members after the war consistently reported that Japanese aviators expressed not anger at their commanders for assigning them to such vulnerable aircraft, but rather a kind of fatalistic acceptance. The aircraft's design was understood as a strategic necessity. Japan needed long-range bombers. This required sacrifices. Crew survival was an acceptable sacrifice. This cultural acceptance of designed-in lethality contrasted starkly with American design philosophy. The comparison with Allied bomber protection systems highlights this fundamental difference in how different nations valued crew survival versus mission capability. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress featured comprehensive crew protection that added approximately 1,000 kilograms to empty weight. Armor plating protected pilot and co-pilot seats. Steel plates ranging from 8 to 13 millimeters thick, positioned behind seats and beneath cockpit floors. Armored bulkheads protected crew positions throughout the fuselage. The bombardier position featured armored glass capable of stopping 20 millimeters cannon shells. Waist gunner positions included protective shields. Self-sealing fuel tanks were standard from the B-17C model onward, introduced in 1941. The weight penalty for this protection was substantial, but American doctrine considered it essential. The B-17's empty weight of approximately 16,200 kilograms reflected this commitment. Roughly 1,000 kilograms, 6% of empty weight, was devoted purely to crew protection systems that added no offensive capability. The North American B-25 Mitchell incorporated similar comprehensive protection, despite being a medium bomber roughly comparable in size to the Betty. Pilot and co-pilot seats featured armor backing. Fuel tanks included self-sealing compounds from early production. The B-25's empty weight of approximately 9,100 kilograms was roughly 2,000 kilograms heavier than the Betty, despite similar size and role. American studies conducted during the war demonstrated the effectiveness of crew protection measures with statistical precision that validated the weight penalty. Analysis of combat damage reports from the 8th Air Force in Europe showed that body armor reduced thoracic wound fatalities from 36% to 8%, a reduction of more than 75% in deaths from chest wounds. Self-sealing fuel tanks reduced fire-related casualties by similar margins. Aircraft equipped with protected fuel systems showed survival rates 3 to 4 times higher than theoretical unprotected aircraft when subjected to comparable combat damage. Protected crew positions increased survival rates in damaged aircraft by providing shielding from shell fragments and small arms fire. Armored glass prevented pilot casualties from head-on attacks, a significant concern given German fighter tactics. Bulkheads compartmentalized the fuselage, preventing fire or damage in one section from spreading throughout the aircraft. The comprehensive approach to crew protection reflected American doctrine that treated trained crews as assets more valuable than aircraft, which could be replaced more easily than experienced combat veterans. A B-17 cost approximately $238,000 to manufacture in 1943. Training a complete crew, pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, and gunners, cost approximately $100,000 in training expenses and consumed 12 to 18 months. If crew protection systems increased aircraft survival by even 20%, they paid for themselves by preserving the more valuable asset. American industrial capacity permitted this weight penalty without sacrificing production numbers. American factories produced 12,731 B-17 bombers and 18,188 B-24 Liberators during the war. The production capacity meant that American forces could field large numbers of protected bombers without compromising capability. Weight penalties for protection didn't prevent achieving desired performance. They simply required more powerful engines and more sophisticated design. Japanese doctrine reached fundamentally different conclusions, shaped by constraints and calculations that reflected Japan's strategic and industrial situation. The Betty's design reflected a calculation that range and striking power outweighed crew survival, not because Japanese planners didn't value their personnel, but because they believed achieving surprise and maintaining initiative would provide sufficient protection. This assumption proved catastrophically wrong, but it wasn't irrational given 1937 circumstances. Japanese planners, observing China campaigns where Japanese forces had achieved overwhelming success despite material disadvantages, concluded that tactical excellence and operational surprise could compensate for technical deficiencies. They assumed enemy opposition would remain limited by range and numbers. They assumed the war would be short and decisive, resolved before enemy industrial advantages could be brought to bear. By mid-1942, every assumption had collapsed. American fighter strength had increased to levels that made Betty interception routine rather than exceptional. By late 1942, American pilots had learned to exploit Betty vulnerabilities systematically. By 1943, Betty formations suffered such devastating losses that missions became statistically indistinguishable from suicide operations. By 1944, Betty bombers could barely operate in daylight against American opposition. The mathematics of the Betty's war were written in fire and loss. Every advantage that made the aircraft formidable in early 1942 became irrelevant once sustained combat against competent opposition began. Range meant nothing when bombers exploded before reaching targets. Speed meant nothing when fighters could intercept from distant bases with radar warning. Payload meant nothing when formations were destroyed before weapon release. The final mission flown by Betty bombers came on August 19, 1945, 4 days after Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. Two white-painted G4M bombers with green crosses departed Atsugi Airfield, carrying Japanese representatives to discuss surrender terms with Allied forces. The aircraft, given call signs Baton 1 and Baton 2, flew to Aoshima, where the Japanese delegation transferred to an American C-54 for transport to Manila. The symbolism was profound and deliberate. The white paint and green crosses indicated peaceful intent, transforming the bombers from weapons of war into vehicles of diplomacy. The call signs referenced Bataan, the location where American forces had surrendered to Japan in April 1942, one of the most devastating defeats in American military history. Now, 3 years later, aircraft bearing those call signs carried Japan's surrender delegation. Lieutenant Denzo Sudo piloted one of the surrender aircraft, a G6M Model 1 transport variant converted from the bomber airframe. The transport variants retained the Betty's distinctive cylindrical fuselage and wing configuration, but carried passengers and cargo rather than weapons. The crew wore dress uniforms rather than flight suits. The aircraft carried no weapons, no ammunition, no military equipment of any kind beyond what was necessary for flight. The flight from Atsugi to Ieshima covered approximately 1,000 kilometers, well within the Betty's range even in transport configuration. American fighters escorted the White Betty bombers throughout their flight, ensuring they remained on the prescribed course. The escort was both protective and supervisory, guaranteeing safe passage while preventing any deviation from planned routes. The White Betty bombers with green crosses became the final image of the aircraft that had opened the Pacific War at Clark Field in December 1941. The circle was complete. The bomber that had destroyed American air power in the Philippines in the war's first hours now carried Japan's surrender delegation in the war's final days. The aircraft that had symbolized Japanese air power's reach and effectiveness now symbolized Japan's defeat and submission to Allied terms. When Major McCoy examined tail number 763-12 at Clark Field in January 1945, he was not just analyzing an enemy aircraft. He was witnessing the physical manifestation of choices made years earlier, choices that prioritized capability over survival, choices that would cost thousands of Japanese aircrew their lives, choices that revealed fundamental differences in how different nations approached warfare. The unprotected fuel tanks were not an accident. They were not an oversight. They were not a temporary expedient. They were a decision, conscious, calculated, and ultimately catastrophic. Japanese designers understood the risks when they made their choices in 1937 and 1938. They calculated the weight penalties. They knew the vulnerabilities. They accepted the trade-offs because they believed the performance advantages would prove decisive in the kind of war they expected to fight. Short, aggressive, resolved through tactical excellence before enemy industrial advantages could be mobilized. They were wrong, and thousands of men paid the price for that miscalculation with their lives. The Betty bomber's legacy extends beyond aviation history into fundamental questions about military design philosophy, acceptable risk, and the value placed on human life in warfare. American designers answered those questions by prioritizing protection even at the cost of performance. Japanese designers answered differently, not because they valued human life less, but because they calculated that the strategic requirements of Japan's military position demanded accepting higher casualties in exchange for capabilities that no other nation possessed. In the end, the nation that valued crew survival built an air force that could sustain operations indefinitely, replacing losses, accumulating experience, and improving capabilities over time. The nation that accepted catastrophic casualties for performance advantages built an air force that destroyed itself through attrition, burning through trained personnel faster than they could be replaced, losing expertise that required years to develop, and ultimately fielding aircraft that their own crews recognized as designed to kill them. The examination of tail number 763-12 at Clark Field provided the final proof of what Allied forces had suspected for years. The Betty bomber was not poorly designed. It was brilliantly designed to achieve specific goals. Those goals simply didn't include bringing Japanese crews home alive. And in that single fact lies the entire story of why Japan lost the Pacific War, not just in the air, but in the fundamental calculation of what nations were willing to sacrifice, what they believed victory required, and what price they would pay in human lives for strategic capabilities that proved insufficient against an enemy whose industrial capacity and design philosophy made attrition warfare sustainable. The thousands of burning Betty bombers that fell across Pacific skies between 1942 and 1945 marked the consequences of that philosophical difference, revealing in fire and statistics what happens when capability is prioritized over survivability, when range is purchased with crew lives, when performance requirements override protection considerations, and when strategic assumptions about the nature of future warfare prove catastrophically wrong.